Well, welcome to the Bright Muse. Today I have Scott Wilson with me, and special guy. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, glad to do it.
So he's going to share his story as it relates to the role that alcohol has played in his life, and so yeah, let's just get right into it.
Started in high school. I think probably like a lot of kids. It's somewhat of a normal high school experience, I think, for a lot of kids. And still remember the first time I had something to drink, and it was I had more than the friends I was hanging out with, which come to find out years later that kind of became a routine and a normal pattern for me. I still remember the first time I had something to drink, and it changed something on the inside that where all of a sudden I felt normal and I felt like who I was supposed to be. It took away the insecurities, the fears, the stuff, the anxieties I had, just kind of all of a sudden were at peace, and I just kind of felt whole. And then went on from there, and I didn't drink all the time. I didn't drink every weekend, didn't drink every day. Went to college, probably did what a lot of college kids do, and but I always drink more than everybody else, most of the people around me.
Okay.
And it still wasn't every day then. It was mostly weekends or Thursdays, kind of whatever typical patterns were in college. Got out of college, and there was a period of years I didn't drink at all, and then picked back up again after my first marriage had ended, and then it was just social and occasionally, and it wasn't all the time. Still might drink a little more than most people, but I was never out of control for a long period of time. But then but it was still that feeling of I felt like I was me when I drink. And a lot of those things that were going on in my head, of the anxieties and fears of either I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough, not fast enough, not smart enough, whatever that is and stuff was, it was just kind of at bay.
Wow.
Over a period of years, my career took off, and had a successful consulting career. It took me all over the world, and got to travel well and dine well and club well, and there was a social aspect of that went with it that did not cause it, but it allowed me to do that more, and it not be as noticeable to everybody.
Yeah.
But even then, I was still was always drinking more than those around me, and it reached a point where even when I was traveling, might take clients to dinner and go have a cocktail afterwards. I would go back to the bar after everybody else left, and that became a very normal occurrence over a period of years. So it didn't happen overnight, but as it started to pick up, then you start to get those feelings and the emotions of, I know I shouldn't be doing this, and I wish I could stop, and I'm trying to stop, and then you get the guilt and shame that starts to set in, and you kind of slowly find yourself in this kind of self-perpetuating cycle or Groundhog Day that picks up.
And can I ask you, were you still having those feelings of you like yourself better when you had some drinks? Yeah, I did, and I like myself better. I thought people around me liked myself better. Right.
And there was probably a period of time where, it was life of the party, and he's fun to be around. But over a period of years, that went from that to, there was this tipping point, which gets behind the biology of the disease, but there was this tipping point, and I can't tell you exactly when it is, and it's different for everybody from an alcoholism perspective. And for an addiction perspective too, if it was on the drug side, I was more on the alcohol side. That kind of, once you cross that bridge, you can't go back. You can never turn it off. And there was a period of time where it might have been easier to stop, but because I had been successful and was smart and had a good career, and I'd always done well, and thought, well, I can fix this.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand. I knew nothing about alcoholism or addiction other than the image I had from growing up, which was it's somebody living homeless under a bridge, or drinking out of a brown bag.
You had mentioned before your parents didn't have alcohol in the house, so it wasn't like something that happened in the home.
I grew up in a home that we didn't, that alcohol wasn't in the house. My grandparents didn't drink on either side of the family. We were in church every time the doors were open, so I grew up in a Southern Baptist tradition. It's just not something that was there. What I would find out later is, and this comes with, I think, just the time and the culture, the period I was raised, that we didn't talk about those things. Right. Well, come to find out, my grandfather had, on my dad's side, had a drinking problem, but he quit back in the 30s, even before AA existed. That my mom's granddad had several brothers that were all alcoholics and died of alcoholism. So it had run in the family, and we just didn't talk about that. So, and I was raised to be self-sufficient and kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and take care of things. And I thought, well, I'll have to figure this out. But there just reached a point where that was no longer possible on my own without a lot of serious help. And from my perspective, it took getting reconnected with God and my faith to help end that craving and stop that cycle. And we can talk more about that in a bit, but the drinking led to where I might be drinking every day while I was on the road, but it wasn't like I was a blackout drunk every day. But over a period of time, that began to escalate to where I was a blackout drunk more days than not. Instead of happy hours on Thursday, Friday, it became Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It became 7 days a week. The happy hours went from 4 to 3 to noon to, early in the day. That, the last year and a half, 2 years of my drinking, there's probably not an hour of the day, most days of those couple of years, that I was not over the legal limit, which is 0.2.
And is that
or
because
0.08.
It just became like you just felt like you had to.
Just at that point, I had to have it, and my body had to have it to function. The science behind it, my organs, all my vital organs, had gotten to a point that they needed the alcohol in the system in order to work. When your brain rewires itself and begins to operate different, and my last day of drinking, I started late morning, and by 8:30 that night was arrested by the Capel Police Department for what would be my second DWI. My last couple of hours of drinking, I put down 2 bottles of Jack Daniels. And what I would find out later from the officer who arrested me, and some others that have seen my video, I still haven't seen the video. I don't really care to. But from what I understand, there's nothing bad on it either. That what shocked them was that my blood alcohol would come back at about 0.4. And most people would die at 0.3. An average person, that would at 0.3, they're looking at death. And I was talking to the officer as clear as I'm talking to you right now. And they actually debated whether or not to arrest me because I passed. I just smelled like a Jack Daniels distillery.
It's incredible. You could function.
And I had a previous conviction for a DWI on my record. Had I not had that, they might have let me go, and I might not be sitting here today. But that's the progression of the disease and the way it works in the body and in the mind. And they've now classified it as a disease of the brain. That it starts this cycle of rewiring the brain, where your body needs it, and then you emotionally, mentally get to this state where you have the guilt and the shame because you're not doing what a normal person should be doing, and now you're covering it up, you're having to lie about it, and it's just this house of cards that's going to come crumbling down, right? So all those things that you were trying to make go away, the fears and the anxieties, Now they're on steroids, and now you really don't like the way you feel.
Which is ironic.
And it's just this self-perpetuating cycle that you can't get yourself out of without help. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I have some drinking buddies that I drink with routinely that aren't here today. And some of those died in my first year of sobriety.
Wow.
But that was a cycle. It was about a 10-year period that when that it really kind of started to pick up slowly, but then really escalated in the last half of that decade. That it got to where it was daily, and it was more to where I was just a blackout drunk almost every day in the last couple of years of it.
Wow.
And still functioning, still had a job, still had. By the last year and a half or so, I wouldn't say I was doing my job great, and didn't get my partnership at the firm renewed, rightfully so. But it was a house of cards. I mean, it was just all the lies you have to tell everybody, and
the secrecy,
and just you start to begin to self-isolate. So I had backed away from responsibilities at church, at home, community, and I didn't drink at home because I didn't want my youngest daughter, to see her dad like that. So I would drink in bars that were close to the community, but I was in effect drinking alone, sitting in the corner, brooding, and not wanting to be or talk to people, and it's just this awful feeling of isolation.
Yeah. How did it affect your relationship?
At the end of my drinking, I wasn't the fun Scott anymore. I was not talkative. I was angry. I was sharp. I was critical and bitter. Just not fun to be around. Either hungover or sick, or it's just not responsible, not showing up, not meeting commitments. I have 3 kids. I have good relationships, great relationships with my oldest and youngest daughter, but my middle child, my son, I haven't talked to in 2 years. And the door's open, and I've tried to make the amends for that, and I've done all I can probably do at this point. But there is damage that's done, and at some point it's you just have to leave it in God's hands, and that's up to Him to take care of the rest. You can only do your part even once you're in recovery. And it's a journey. It's not like it's cured overnight. I ended up going to rehab for a month. I worked did intensive outpatient for it was 3 or 4 months, where I was going to outpatient sessions 3 days a week, and I was going to 1 to 2 AA meetings a day, 6-7 days a week. And I did that for the better part of 8-9 months.
Wow.
In the first year of my sobriety, I really focused on it. I didn't work.
Yeah, you did.
I just focused on my sobriety.
Wow.
Because for me, I was at the point, I had pushed it so far, not knowing it, but I had pushed it so far that they call it passive suicide. I wanted to die. Every day I hoped that I would not come home, that I would just hit a telephone pole, hit a bridge by myself, and that would be the end, and everybody could go on and be happy. I would learn that when I got to rehab and the counseling that I did, of where I was at, in the state of mind I was in. But fortunately, I had that moment of clarity and reached out and asked for help and got help.
Yeah, and before we get to that part, I just wanted to make clear too that you were at a point, because you had mentioned before that you couldn't just stop cold turkey, because literally it could kill you, and that this is and I want people to understand, that this is so much bigger than yourself. You have to reach out for help.
Yeah, so I did quit cold turkey, and I do not recommend it. As not a pleasant experience, even from what little I remember. I did have, so you get arrested in Capel, you end up in the Carrollton jail. I went into convulsions that night, and I know this from somebody else that watched all of it happen. They had asked, they kept requesting that they call an ambulance to get me to a hospital because the person that saw me was an alcoholic that had been through this and seen this before.
Okay.
I still don't remember any of that part of the night, but evidently I went into a lot of convulsions and stuff, and that's just my body reacting to not having alcohol in it and needing it.
Wow.
And it can kill for an alcoholic that is that kind of far down in the disease. It is very dangerous and deadly.
Scary.
And you have to, the best way to do it is, if you're something you're struggling with or a loved one is to get them to a doctor to help them detox safely, where then they can then take the steps to go to treatment, go to counseling, get help, go to AA, whatever that looks like for them that works for them. For me, I found a treatment center that focused on the 12 steps and also had a faith component to it, because that's something that was important to me with how I grew up and what I knew to be important to me, that's where I was going to find the answer.
Sure.
But it is something that has to be done medically and safely when you're that far along, because it can be deadly.
Good to know.
Yeah. And that's one of the differences between alcoholics and addicts. Addicts it can be painful and it is miserable, but it's not as deadly necessarily for an addict to quit cold turkey as it is for an alcoholic. The inverse is true on the relapse side. Usually the addict remembers how much they used of the substance they used the last time, so that's what they go back to do, to try to get that feeling they're trying to get. And their body isn't built up to that amount of drug in their system, and so that's what ends up killing them. Whereas the alcoholic can almost pick right back up where they left off, and their body will, their brain will rewire and their organs will go, yep, we're back, game on.
Wow.
And that's just one of the, it's still the same root problem at the end of the day. And it still has a common solution to the problem.
So you have an interesting story about when you were arrested, and kind of want to hear a little bit about that tipping point and why that story is interesting with that particular police officer.
So I was arrested by Officer Bryce Lee, who was one of the new officers in the Capel Police Department. We were in front of the Ace Hardware, and he would pull me over and come up to the car, and this is one of the few things I remember about the night. And you'll hear some alcoholics or addicts talk about they had this moment of clarity, and they don't know why, because they were so messed up. But all of a sudden there was this moment of, I don't want to die.
Right.
And
not like I know, but
you don't want to know, but you do. So if you're fortunate, you have that moment of clarity, and I'm grateful I did, because it doesn't happen for everybody. He walked up and asked if I knew why he would pull me over, and my response was yes, and I give up, I can't do this anymore, or something along those lines. He had no idea what I meant, because he's like, well, you're not wanted for anything. In his mind, he's already got my record. He knows he's pulling over a drunk driver, and he didn't understand that at the time. About 9 months later, 10 months later, I would go back in to meet with our former police chief, Mac Tristan, because I wanted to thank the officer who arrested me, because with that event and some of the things that happened in jail with that next 48 hours, with how God kind of stepped in that moment when I just kind of said, I can't do this, God. I don't know how to live, but I don't want to die. I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Some events happened within minutes after saying that prayer that God started getting my attention, and then I would go to rehab and come through that, and I just wanted to go thank the officer and also make amends for anything I might have done that night, because I still don't know what my behavior was that night. Now, I do, to the extent that Bryce and I have talked, and I was polite and eloquent and one of the most courteous drunks I have ever arrested.
Well, and he had said he'd never, in his career, he had never had anyone come back and thank him.
And Mac, who'd been a police officer for over 30 years at that point, was like, I've never had anybody do this. And I'm like, well, I can't talk for anybody else. I just feel like it's something I need to do.
Yeah, it's really awesome.
And so I ended up meeting Bryce, and we're friends today. And he would then hear the whole story in the background of how bad my disease was at that point. He arrested me, and he said, well, now it all makes sense why you said what you said. Now I get it. Wow. But yeah, we're friends to this day, and that's
that's really cool.
The gift of sobriety of how all this has come full circle is being friends with Mac and the new police chief Danny and a bunch of the officers, and having told my story at the department a couple of times, and working with the teen diversion program here in Capel for kids that are caught with a first-time offense. Mm-hmm. And then you and I did the Citizens Police Academy, so I am a graduate of the Capel Citizens Police Academy.
Yep.
Who would have thought?
Watch out for our patrol car,
I remember Paul Gonzalez and I were talking about it, and I'm like, well, Paul, do I really need to do this? Because you already know my record, and why fill out the paperwork if they're just going to tell me no? And he kind of chuckled, and he said, we will look, but you happen to be friends with the police chief, so I think you're okay. So fill out the paperwork. And I did, and it was kind of a good kind of full circle of kind of start to finish of how things can change, and from my perspective, just the grace that God has, because I shouldn't be sitting here today at all.
And you've had, we don't have to go through them all, but you've had points along the way in your story, like the statement that was written on your pants. You had to spend the night in jail, and
somebody
so many
when I had to change clothes in the Dallas County Jail and get that wonderful striped uniform for that one night I was there in the fall of 2015. Somebody had written on the left leg in my thigh, where the stripe was, on the white stripe in blue ink, where I could read it looking down, it said, God loves you. And I would end up in the cell with a few hours later with the guy that had written that on those pants like 3 or 4 months before, and thought he'd never see him again.
Wow.
As he pulled a Bible out of his bag to go do a Bible study and said, somebody's looking after you tonight. And I had a couple more incidences like that would happen in that 24 to 36 hour period before I would leave that got my attention. That was like, okay, all right, God, I know you're listening. I don't get all this, I don't understand it, but I'll just take the next step, and did that all the way through rehab and getting out, and to where, here I am today.
Yeah, it's really cool. Did you ever find that psalm that?
No, I can't remember which psalm it is, and I usually don't forget it, but it was about a year, I guess, or so after I had gotten sober. The day I was arrested, November 23rd of 2015, that morning, my mom, who has always been faithful, does her quiet times every morning, keeps a prayer journal, prays for anybody and everybody. She had that morning read in one of the Psalms, and I can't remember which one it was, but there's a verse in it that talks about the drunk, like being like the drunkard who's lost at sea, and the Psalm talking about coming out of that, and that God stepping in to calm the seas and to restore them. And her prayer she wrote down that morning was along the lines of rescue my son from alcoholism and restore him. She would forget that because that was the Monday before Thanksgiving. I would fess up to the family that Thursday night at the ranch at Thanksgiving of what had happened, how bad it was, what I was about to go do to try to get well because I was dying if I didn't. And so she would forget she had written that down. And it was about a year later she was doing her quiet time, and she was back on the Psalms and read it and thought, I've read this before. When was the last time I read it? She started flipping back through her prayer journal and found it, and it was the morning that I was arrested, and her prayer was that I would be rescued and saved from my alcoholism. Wow. And that was
Wow. That's really, really special. God works through our moms sometimes.
And that was the start of that journey of all those events that would happen that night. You know, we wouldn't remember that. We wouldn't know that part of it until a year later when Mom happened to flip back through her prayer journal.
Yeah.
Because she prayed for her son.
Wow.
And then she wrote down that day, you know, that prayer had been answered.
Wow. That's really a powerful story. Wow.
You know, and that's, you know, people ask, I'm not big on religion. I'm big on a relationship. And I certainly go to church. I have a church I like. But it's not church that does it. It's the relationship. And what I have found in sobriety is that God truly does care. And He cares about all the details of your life. You know, He cared enough to show up for this drunk guy sitting in a jail who's just drunk out of his mind and had been, yet He was there waiting. You know, I just had to be the one to look up. And it's been that way ever since. You know, I'm certainly not perfect even to this day. You know, I constantly have things to work on, but
you're in good company.
But that's life. I mean, we all do, and we all have our thing.
Right.
You know, mine just happened to be alcoholism. You know, for other people, it's fear, it's anxiety, it's depression, it's drugs, it's, you know, it could be porn addiction, it can be gambling addiction. There are all sorts of things that are out there that paralyze people. Some are deadly, some aren't. But they're all can make your life miserable.
Yeah.
It's just at what point do you want to say, I don't want to live this way anymore?
Right.
And
surrender.
You look for help and you surrender.
Yeah.
You know, for me, that, you know, what I have found worked was my faith and a recovery program based around the 12 steps. You know, that I continually work and practice on, and go to meetings and help others, and I have found that works for me. You know, today I don't sit and think about not drinking today. You know, I think about it's usually around my character defects and my flaws. They start to come back up, my fears or my anxieties, and I recognize it today. And I can stand back and go, okay, wait a minute, this is okay. Here's how I need to deal with this. You know, it's not, oh my God, I'm going to go, there's a bottle of Jack Daniels, I'm going to go drink. You can put one here and my mouth might water, but I'm not going to go, oh my God, I need a drink.
Right.
But that's because I do all this other stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, and that's why I do stuff like this. It's not, you know, I don't consider myself anything special other than I gave God a chance, and I stepped out on faith, and I followed what people had done before me, and it worked. And if this helps somebody save a life or let them know that there's hope, because somebody did that for me.
Yeah.
They told their story in a Sunday school class 6 years before I got sober, and that was the day I knew what my problem was. But I still wasn't ready to surrender, because I thought, well, I'm successful and I'm smart, I'll figure this out, I'll fix it. You know, what I found out is I'm not God, and there's just some things I can't fix.
And they planted the seed.
They planted the seed.
And that's what makes you special, is that you are doing the same thing and reaching out and helping people, and the power can be had once you get this ugly secret out, you know.
Well, that's
so many can share.
That was the other part that I found that's been refreshing about this whole journey, is the freedom that comes from that. That it, of not trying to cover up the lies and all that stuff anymore. I mean, yeah, there's some people that have a problem with it, but that's not my issue. That's their issue.
Right.
You know, this is who I am. I'm not defined by who I was.
Right.
And you know, that's I'll let God take care of the rest. I just have to try to do the next right thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing, Scott.
You bet. Thank you.
That
thank you for what you're doing.
You
I think it's great that you're hitting some of these topics, you know, and getting it out there for people to be able to share. Because I think just people need to know they're not alone. That they can. It's okay to ask for help.
Yeah.
You know, we've all got stuff to deal with, and there are people that want to help.
It's a short life, you know.
Yeah.
Let's make the most of it.
Make the best of it and enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, I love people's stories, and just the heartfelt part of people's stories that I think connects with so many of us. Even though maybe I haven't had an alcohol problem, maybe I've had some, you know, something else, but the theme is generally not the same, but it's very similar, you know, where we can connect.
Well, and I think the other thing I found is whatever that thing is that is your hang up or your personal issue, that when you start to look at that for what it is and start to work on that, you tend not to be as reactive to the world around you, because you start to look at, okay, everybody has their stuff. I don't know what they're going through. You know, I something going on in their life that I may not be aware of. I need to show a little grace.
Right.
You know, and I'm not perfect at it, but I try to do the best I can.
Yeah.
And recognize everybody's got their stuff.
Yep.
You know, be kind, try to do the right thing, and help others.
All right. Well, thanks, man. Keep
You bet.
doing
Thank
what
you.
you're doing.
All right.